The lesson no one expected. The Orion Exchange Academy circled a pale blue dwarf star with towers of glass and lecture halls shaped like petals around a central dome, and its gardens carried lighter gravity, so that nervous species from gentler worlds could walk without strain. And today, Petal Hall 6 was filled with alien freshmen who were ready for their first xenobiology lesson, the promise of a live but safely sedated specimen, bringing excitement and unease at the same time, because most of them had never been close to a creature designed by nature to kill. The lights were bright and every bench hummed softly, and the smell of polished stone mixed with the tang of cleaning chemicals, but still the students fidgeted with nervous crests, twitching wings folding and tails curling because instinct remembered that teeth were real even if rules said safety was absolute. The air shifted when the door slid open and a human stepped inside, late but calm moving, with an ease that did not belong to the room. Mason Clark, citizen of Earth, whose name was not yet known to the class, walked between the rows with a soft excuse, me settling at the back, his face unreadable and his breathing slow and steady, while all around him antennae bent away and eyes glanced sidelong as if trying not to provoke a predator, because everyone had read the Academy profile that labeled Earth as a death world and humans as survivors of the harshest trials, and it was hard to believe that someone shaped by such a place could sit quietly among them. Professor Kira Velen cleared her throat, and the massive screen above her showed the diagram of a razorback stalker, a low-slung predator from Gliese 2 with spines like jagged knives that rose whenever it scented fear, and jaws strong enough to pry open armor, shellfish, or bone, and her voice carried with academic certainty. Today we will study the muscle arc along the dorsal line. You will observe a live but sedated specimen contained and restrained. It is perfectly safe. Relief moved across the room like a wave because sedated meant harmless, and the crate rolled in on wheeled tracks, transparent walls glowing with monitors, and inside lay the beast-strapped muzzle pressed against the barrier body still, except for slow breathing that fogged the glass like ghosts of air. The professor explained the sedation system and pointed to the monitor where a soft line showed a steady pulse, and students leaned forward, their fear folding under the promise of science. But Mason watched differently, his eyes not fixed on the data but on the creature itself, his posture loose, but every detail of his attention sharp, the way someone listens to weather when they know storms can lie. A faint scraping cut through the lecture, a tail spine dragging against the crate wall sharp as metal on stone, and every alien body stiffened, frills lifting, wings pressing tight. But Professor Velen smiled as though humoring children, residual reflex, nothing dangerous, and she turned back to her notes. Then the stalker opened one eye and the room froze. Breath caught in 100 throats, the straps creaked against sudden muscle strain, and the transparent wall vibrated with a deep groan. The security light flashed red, the professor's hand hovered over the alarm but never pressed it because denial is a scholar's reflex, and in that still second Mason stood up, not fast, not loud, simply rising as if his body carried a different rhythm from panic. He walked down the aisle, palms, empty chin, low voice, quiet like slow water running over stone. Easy now, there you are. That is ground under you, that is air in your chest, and the predator's spines flared into a broken crown. But Mason never looked directly at its eyes. He looked at the space. Beside the muzzle, shoulders angled so he was neither prey fleeing nor challenger approaching. He became something uninteresting, something safe. Students whispered but could not move. The professor whispered security protocol, but Mason lifted one finger without breaking tone and said, "Not yet. Alarms will slice the air, and slicing means chase. And when chase lives in the air, teeth follow." He crouched until he was level with the beast, his words steady. "Do not be exciting to a hungry thing, be boring, be still, be a stump in its forest." His hand moved along the crate wall slow enough for even fear to count the beats, and he touched the strap buckle where muscle trembled about to tear itself. He loosened it a fraction so the tension bled away and whispered, "Pain becomes hunger. We ease the pain first." The stalker's breathing shifted, harsh at first, then longer and heavier spines, lowering from knife to brush as Mason murmured about rivers, frogs, and reeds bending in ordinary wind. The predator laid its head down, not asleep, not tamed, but listening. And Mason guided the crate back into the bay in careful pulses, until it rolled inside the dim light. He ordered the professor dim to swamp dusk, Hum a low-frequency match, it's natural. Rest call, and slowly the stalker's breath grew calm and its eyes closed once more. Then the injector hissed again, but the creature did not flinch, and the doors returned to green. The class exhaled together, chests rising as if a storm had passed, and the professor's hands shook as she gripped the desk. She asked his name, voice heavy with gratitude, and Mason said, "Mason Clark of Earth Habitability Class, E-3 known." As Deathworld and the word hung in the air with gravity stronger than the star outside. When the others left, Mason stayed to help check every strap, every seal, and when he reached the sedative panel, he saw the code shimmer with signs of a manual override. He said softly, "Someone taught the system to lie," and the next lesson was waiting hidden like a shadow with no owner yet. Calm hands on a living weapon. The incident in the lecture hall did not fade with the closing of the bay doors. Instead, it spread like smoke through every corridor of the Orion Exchange Academy. By the time the students left the building, rumors had already swollen into exaggerated tales. Some whispered that the stalker had broken free and would have slaughtered them all. If not for the human, others swore that Mason had stared the beast into submission with the deadly glare of a predator of predators, and some muttered in uneasy tones that the professor had lost control of her own classroom and been saved only because a Deathworlder happened to sit at the back. Yet all of them carried the same image in their minds: the human walking forward while everyone else froze. Professor Valen filed her report with exacting detail, recording how the sedation system had failed, how the crate had nearly ruptured, and how one of her students had prevented bloodshed, but her hands lingered on the final lines when she admitted that Mason Clark's behavior could not be explained by training alone. He had acted with instinct, refined by a lifetime of surviving creatures, far more dangerous than any found on Gliese II. When she signed the document, she felt the weight of an academy watching and judging her credibility, because allowing a predator to awaken in a classroom was a failure. And yet she could not deny that she had learned something from the human's quiet control. Mason himself did not boast. He walked through campus with the same calm steps, carrying no sense of victory. He attended his other classes on time, sat quietly, took notes, and gave short, respectful answers when called upon. But everywhere he went, heads turned, whispers followed, and security drones scanned his face more often than others, as if the academy was still deciding whether to call him guardian or threat. One evening, he found himself summoned to a small chamber near the administration dome where a panel of 3 instructors waited with tight expressions. They questioned him about every motion, every word during the event. Why did you approach the predator? Why did you refuse the alarm? Why did you touch the strap? And Mason answered, in the same slow voice, because if the alarm screamed, the stalker would hear chase. Because if the strap tore, the muscle would hurt itself into madness. Because if I looked into its eyes, I would throw a spear. I did none of these, so the moment bent and did not break. One of the instructors muttered dangerous instincts, the others nodded. But Professor Velen, who sat at the far end, raised her hand and said, dangerous only if left unshared. We have students from 35 worlds who know only theories of fear and survival. Perhaps it is time to learn from someone who has lived it. The panel exchanged glances, their crests fluttering with doubt. Yet they wrote that the human would be observed closely, but allowed to continue study. The decision satisfied. No one entirely, but the academy could not ignore results. In the dorm halls, the alien students spoke of Mason with conflicted tones. Some feared him more than before, believing that his presence itself attracted danger. But others admired him, though they would not admit it openly. One student, a small aquatic being named Solari, whose species hated violence more than anything, followed him at a distance for days, until finally she gathered courage to approach her body quivering in the gravity harness that kept her gills moist. She asked, how did you stay calm when the stalker looked at you like prey? Mason crouched so their eyes were level and answered, because fear is loud and predators follow sound, so I make my fear quiet. Solari repeated the words slowly, as though tasting them, and for the first time in her life the phrase made courage feel like something she could practice rather than dream. Meanwhile, in the maintenance sector, the professor who had rechecked the sedative system discovered what Mason had already seen. Someone had tampered with the codes. It was not a machine failure, but a deliberate override, lines of instruction hidden under ordinary commands designed to fade after use. If Mason had not looked closely, the trail would have been lost. She brought this knowledge to the security board, but they hesitated to spread panic. Accusing shadows without proof, the idea of sabotage, raised too many questions. The Academy had always prided itself on neutrality and peace, but now whispers of an anti-human faction began to crawl through the halls. The next class met again under the same roof, though with more guards at the doors. Professor Velen announced that Mason Clark would help demonstrate predator psychology. Under her supervision, some students reacted with outrage, others with nervous curiosity. The stalker remained locked away, but the memory of its eye remained sharp in their minds. Mason stood at the front. His hands open, his voice level, he spoke of body language thresholds, how to stand, so that fear does not become a trigger, how to breathe so that panic does not become invitation. And he said, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is teaching fear to sit quietly beside you. The words unsettled many, but they listened because they had already seen proof, and though the hall filled with learning and doubt, something darker waited in silence for the next chance to strike. Whispers and warnings. The Academy never slept because students from a 100 system studied under the glow of a dwarf star, and its corridors were filled with soft voices and quick steps. But after the incident, the whispers grew sharp and heavy, and Mason Clark felt them wherever he walked. Some called him hero. Others called him hazard, and though he kept his stride even and his voice steady, he could not ignore the way groups broke apart when he approached or the way security drones paused longer over his face. Professor Velen knew, too, that the Academy had shifted, and not in a simple way. Her colleagues stopped her in the faculty dome with smiles that were too thin and questions that curved like knives. What exactly happened in your lecture? How close did the students come to harm? Are you sure? The human did not provoke it. She answered with clarity, but her own doubt remained because in her private console she replayed the sensor data again and again. The sedation had not failed by chance. She had traced the code as far as she could until the lines blurred into shadows. Someone had tampered with the system with skill and intention. It was not random malfunction. The discovery burned at her thoughts even when she tried to lecture or sleep. She asked herself who would endanger an entire class just to make a point, and the only answer that returned was that someone wanted the human framed because who else could benefit from such chaos? Mason never asked for thanks, but he noticed the way Professor Valen's eyes stayed sharp on every detail, the way she kept glancing at security feeds as though she knew more than she spoke. And one night when the lecture hall was quiet, he asked her straight, "Do you believe it was accident?" She hesitated long enough that the silence answered. Before her voice did, no accident. The story of the Razorback spread beyond campus into news threads across the sector. Short reports framed with exaggeration. Human student subdues live predator without weapons. Human calm prevents massacre human. From Death World shows unnatural control over lethal fauna. And while some readers praised the feat, others wrote warnings. If this is what one human can do, imagine what 1,000 could manage. The words circulated through governments and councils, and soon diplomats were exchanging worried glances over encrypted channels because the shadow of Earth had always been uncertain. And now it seemed darker than before. Within the Academy, the alien students carried the story into their own cultures. One insectoid recounted it to her hive cluster with trembling wings. A reptilian broadcast it to his brood as proof that Deathworlders walked in shadow with predators themselves. But Solari, the timid aquatic student, remembered something else. She remembered Mason crouching to her height and saying, "Fear is loud, courage is teaching it to sit." She repeated those words until they became rhythm in her gills, and for the first time she dared to walk alone through the hall without looking over her shoulder. She even sat closer to the front of the lecture, her gaze steady whenever Mason spoke, and though she still trembled, she felt the tremble was no longer command. Meanwhile, in the high dome of the Administration Council, a quiet meeting took place. 3 instructors, the dean and a representative from the security board, gathered to decide how to proceed. They reviewed the footage and asked themselves whether Mason had acted with discipline or with dangerous instinct. Some argued he had endangered the class further by refusing the alarm. Others countered that the alarm would have driven the predator to frenzy. The debate spiraled until the dean said, "The truth is that the students are safer now than before because they have seen fear contained by calm yet still. We must ask how the sedative failed." Their answer came in the form of an encrypted file slipped under Professor Velen's research channel. The file carried traces of access logs pointing to a faction of students, whose voices had long argued against the presence of humans at the academy. She opened the file alone, her face pale under the glow of the screen, and when she read the hidden commands, she understood that the stalker had not been meant to teach. It had been meant to kill or at least to terrify, and when Mason passed by her office, she stepped out and said in a voice low with urgency, "Watch yourself. Not all here are glad you saved them." Mason did not change his expression, but he nodded once, his eyes steady, and he replied, "Danger does not vanish when you name it, it only changes shape. I have lived with that shape my whole life." Solari overheard the words from down the corridor, and she felt them carved deep into her memory, because they did not sound like boasting, they sounded like weather reporting something constant and unstoppable. That night the academy hummed with nervous tension. Lights dimmed earlier than usual, and students gathered in tight clusters as though waiting for another alarm to break the calm. The predator was locked away, but its shadow remained in every mind, and while Mason slept lightly with his back against the wall and one hand resting near the emergency beacon, a darker plan was already moving through. The maintenance ducts carried by those who wanted to prove that humans did not belong. The anatomy of courage, Professor Valen stood before the class with a stillness that disguised her unease. The razorback stalker remained locked deep within the containment wing, yet its presence lingered like a shadow across every lesson. The administration had approved a new seminar, one that would not only dissect anatomy, but also confront the living weight of fear and courage, and Mason Clark stood beside her at the front of the hall. Not as a guest, but as a co-instructor. The idea had unsettled many instructors, but the council had ruled that knowledge should not be silenced when survival itself was at stake. The students filled the hall again, some pressing close to the exits, others sitting stiffly with nervous gestures, their colors bright with stress. Solari sat in the front row, her gills quivering as she adjusted her moisture harness, but she kept her eyes steady on Mason, ready to hear his words. Mason began not with slides or diagrams, but with his own voice, low and steady. He said, "Animals do not see charts. They see posture. They smell heartbeats. They taste the air when we stand with fear. Loud in our skin, they know it, and when we breathe steady, they know that too." He moved across the stage, slow as flowing water. His shoulders relaxed, his steps soft. He showed them how even the tilt of a head could be challenge or submission, how the wideness of eyes could invite strike or stillness. Professor Valen added structure, pointing to hollows of muscle arcs, scent glands, and reflex lines, but it was Mason's presence that kept the students silent. He explained how on Earth children learned early to read shadow and sound, how a twig breaking at night could mean survival or death. He told them that courage was not magic. It was not born. It was practiced in small steps every day. He said courage is teaching fear to sit beside you without letting it lead you. Solari repeated the phrase under her breath as though binding it to her own trembling heart. The class engaged with questions. One insectoid asked, "How can we change the smell of fear?" Mason answered, "You cannot erase it, but you can layer it with other scents, food, sweat, soil. The smell of calm practice can make your body sing quieter to predators." A reptilian student hissed that such skills seemed unnatural. Mason replied, "Nothing is unnatural to survival. It is only unfamiliar," and the hall sank into thoughtful silence. As the seminar stretched on, Valen invited Mason to demonstrate responses to threat. She activated a hollow predator simulation. The shimmer of a scaled beast filled the front of the hall, jaws wide, eyes bright. Mason faced it with shoulders turned slightly away. His breath matching the hologram's pace, he explained that predators listen to rhythm when you break rhythm with panic. They pounce when you steady rhythm with calm. They paused the simulation, lunged, but Mason held his ground, body angled, voice even, and the image froze at the moment before strike. Velen cut the program, but the lesson remained sharp as glass. Later after class, the students lingered in groups debating what they had learned. Some claimed such techniques would never work outside controlled rooms. Others admitted they had felt something shift inside them, as though survival was no longer only theory. Solari followed Mason again, her voice small but braver than before. She asked, "Can you teach me to silence fear truly?" Not only for one moment, Mason crouched again to her level and said, It takes time. It takes practice. It takes trusting that fear will not leave you, but you can walk beside it without letting it crush you. She nodded with a determination that surprised her own trembling limbs. In the faculty dome, Valine faced pressure from colleagues who argued she was giving the human too much authority. But she countered with hard data the students were learning. Faster their performance under stress tests improved. They were beginning to see survival not as shame but as skill. She said, "If we shut the human out, we close the door on knowledge. Our academy claims to value the debate continued." But for the first time, Valine felt certainty in her stance. Mason's presence was not threat. It was lesson. Yet behind the bright lights of the lecture halls, darker threads continued to weave. The tampered codes had not been forgotten. The faction that sought to drive the human out had not abandoned its aim. And while Mason spoke of calm and rhythm, their enemies studied sabotage and waited for the moment to strike again. The academy had opened the anatomy of courage, but soon it would be forced to test whether courage could hold when teeth were real, and mercy was choice. Sabotage in the lab. The academy nights were never truly silent, for the halls hummed with life support systems and the faint voices of students studying late in their dorms. But within the xenobiology wing, the quiet felt heavier, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Professor Valine had grown accustomed to walking the halls after dark, checking locks and seals. Since the day of the failed sedation, she could not trust the systems anymore, and she kept her eyes sharp for irregular shadows or flickers in the console screens. Mason often joined her, his footsteps soft, his presence steady, and though she told him he did not need to guard her, he answered simply that, on his world, safety was never assumption, it was choice. On the fourth evening after the seminar, Valine noticed something wrong in the lab bay. The access panel had been opened recently. Though no classes were scheduled, the locks registered proper clearance, yet her code had not been used. Mason knelt by the panel, his fingers brushing the faint scorch marks of a forced override. Someone had entered quietly with skill when they stepped inside the bay. The lights glowed dim, and the Razorback stalker lay strapped as always, its breath slow under sedative, yet Mason tilted his head as though listening to an unseen rhythm, and he whispered, "Too quiet. The hum is wrong." Valine checked the monitor, and her chest tightened. The sedation line showed, "Steady." But Mason shook his head no. This creature should breathe deeper. Before she could respond, the Razorback's spines flickered. The straps trembled, and the beast let out a low growl that rattled the walls. The sedative had been tampered again, and this time it was not failing. It was gone. Valine reached for the alarm, but the bay doors slammed shut, heavy barriers locking them inside. Red light flooding the room. Mason pulled her back against the wall, saying calmly, "Not panic. We move. Smart." The stalker rose, fully awake, its eyes burning with hunger, not confusion, its muzzle snapping at the air. This was no accident. This was release, deliberate and timed to trap them. From the corridor outside came a faint echo, the sound of students shouting. Before the security field sealed the wing, Mason cursed under his breath, but his voice remained even inside the bay. With them was not only the Predator, but also 3 students who had been finishing a late project. One of them was Solari, her gills fluttering wildly, her body pressed against the corner. In terror, she cried out, "The doors will not open." Mason steadied his voice. "Then they will not open yet, but we will find another way." The stalker lunged across the room, spines scraping sparks against the metal floor. Mason moved with sharp precision, pulling Valine and the students behind a stack of equipment. He picked up a reflective shield disc from the supply rack and angled it, so the Predator caught its own movement for a breath. It hesitated. Distracted, Mason used the pause to guide them toward the maintenance hatch, but the panel was sealed with override. He pressed his hand against the metal, feeling the faint draft behind it. He knew the ducts were open on the other side. The stalker struck again, claws tearing grooves in the floor. Solari whimpered, but Mason crouched to her level, whispering, "Steady, breathe with me. Match my pace, 1-2-1-2. She followed, trembling. Yet the rhythm steadied her. Mason lifted a piece of piping and hurled it across the bay. The sound echoed sharp, drawing the Predator's attention away. Then he guided the group toward the corner, their steps slow, deliberate, not prey running, but shadows shifting. Velen tried again at the hatch with her code, but the lock refused. Mason placed his hand over hers, calm voice saying, "Machines can be tricked, same as animals. Give me a minute." He pulled a tool from his belt, a simple human multi-tool, not regulation, and began to pry at the circuits with steady patience. The stalker turned back, spines rising, eyes narrowing. It smelled the fear rising again. Mason whispered louder now. "Boring, boring, boring. Do not invite chase." He held Solari's trembling hands, pressing them against her harness, so she felt her own heartbeat, slowing, her eyes wide but no longer wild. At last the panel gave way. The hatch opened with a hiss. Mason shoved the students inside, first Solari, last then Velen. He stayed by the entrance, watching the predator circle closer, its spines rattling the air. He whispered, "Go, do not stop." And when the stalker lunged, he slammed the shield disc down hard against the floor. The clang thundered through the bay like a storm, startling the creature long enough for Mason to slip through the hatch and drag it close behind him. They crawled through the ducts, breathing hard, the hum of the predator echoing behind the wall. Solari whispered, "Why are they doing this? Who would risk our lives like this?" Mason answered flat, "Because fear of humans is louder than logic, and someone wants to prove their fear true." His eyes burned in the darkness, but his voice remained even. The ducts led them into a maintenance corridor where the emergency lights flickered on. Velen stood shaking with anger, not at the predator, but at the betrayal, and she said, "They will not stop with this, they will try again." Mason nodded and replied, "Then we will be ready." But even as they caught their breath, alarms began to blare across the academy, echoing through the halls, not warning of a malfunction but of full sabotage, and the night that had begun with quiet had turned into open war against calm death world lessons under fire. The alarms screamed through every corridor of the academy, turning calm halls into rivers of confusion. Students stumbled from dorms. Security drones zipped in confused patterns, and instructors barked orders over failing comms. But inside the sealed xenobiology wing, the danger was not just sound. It was real. The razorback stalker prowled, free behind them in the bay, its claws striking metal walls, while Mason Clark guided Professor Velen Solari and the other trapped students through narrow maintenance corridors, every step echoing like a signal for the beast to follow. The emergency barriers had locked down the main route, so Mason steered them toward ducts and service shafts. His voice, even though the alarms battered their ears, he said, "Move slow, breathe steady. The predator will follow vibration." Not just sound, they obeyed, trembling, but listening. Solari's gills fluttered with every breath. Yet she forced them to match his rhythm, counting 1-2-1-2 as he had taught her in the lab. Velen clutched her console, trying to override locks, but the system spat back. Denial after denial. Someone was inside the network, twisting controls against them. In the gloom of the duct, Mason paused, holding a hand to the metal. He closed his eyes, feeling the faint rush of air the predator was hunting, using its nose, its ears, its hunger. He whispered, "It is close." Then reached into his belt, pulling out a shard of reflective alloy he had grabbed from the lab. He angled it toward a junction where two ducts met. The light from the alarm beacons caught the shard and bounced down the wrong path. A moment later, claws scraped that way, fooled for now. Mason urged them forward. The ducts opened into a lower maintenance hall wide enough to run, but Mason held up his hand. "No running. If you run, you shout, pray instead. Move like." Stone falling slow and certain, they obeyed, creeping across the corridor until a crash from above signaled a vent bursting open, and the stalker dropped into the hall. Eyes burning, spines flared. The students screamed. Solari stumbled. Mason stepped between them and the beast, raising his arms not as weapon but as signal. He did not face it head on. Instead, he angled his body sideways, his breathing slow, deliberate. He spoke in low tones, meant to ride the creature's pulse. "Easy, storm. Easy, shadow." It hesitated, spines rattling with hunger. Mason motioned for Velen to lead the others toward a side passage. The stalker lunged, but Mason was already moving, rolling to the side, grabbing a length of pipe from the floor. He slammed it against the wall, creating a thunder of sound. The predator wheeled, chasing the noise, not the flesh. Mason backed slowly into another shaft, guiding it away. Sweat slick on his face, but his voice never breaking pattern. Valen pulled Solari along, whispering, "Hurry." But the human's words still echoed calm over panic. Deep in the shaft, Mason finally met the saboteur, a tall insectoid student whose crest quivered with hatred. His eyes burned with a conviction sharper than claws. He hissed, "Humans bring danger. The Academy is no place for your kind. You bend predators with trickery, but you are predator too." Mason stood steady, the stalker creeping closer behind the insectoid. Mason said, "You freed it. You risked every life to prove your fear." "Right, the saboteurs." Mandibles clicked. He raised a weapon, a charged prod sparking blue. Mason lowered his pipe, his voice level again. "Choices write our story. You can end it with slaughter or with courage." The insectoid spat. "I choose survival of the true." The stalker struck, then not at Mason but at the saboteur. The noise of his weapon had drawn it. Mason lunged, shoving the insectoid aside, grabbing the prod and slamming it into the floor with a roar of sparks. The predator reeled, spines crackling. Mason shouted, "Go now." He herded both saboteur and predator apart using the sparks as lure, until Valen's override finally opened a security hatch. She screamed for Mason to come. He backed toward the hatch step by step, never turning his back, never breaking rhythm. The stalker hissed one last time before retreating into shadows, chasing the echo of sparks. When the hatch sealed, the group collapsed in exhaustion. Solari pressed her forehead to the floor, whispering, "He did not let fear win." Mason knelt beside her, voice low, not pride, just truth. "Fear never leaves, it only learns manners." Valen stared at him, shaking with fury, not at him, but at the academy that had let sabotage breed. She said, "This is no longer mistake. It is war inside our own halls." Mason nodded, his eyes steady. "Then we fight with calm. Not panic, with choice, not rage." But even as they spoke, another alarm rose, this one, not for predator but for breach. Something larger than the stalker had been released somewhere else in the academy. The saboteurs had not finished, and the night was not yet done. The day fear learned manners. The academy stood on edge under the red wash of emergency lights. Students packed into auditoriums waiting for updates while security drones buzzed restless above them. The sabotage had shaken every layer of the institution. Predators released locks, broken codes, rewritten, and through it all, one constant voice had guided survival: Mason Clark, the Death Worlder, who never raised his voice and never let fear write his story. Now the administration demanded a public demonstration to calm the chaos. They argued that students must see control, not rumor. They must see that danger could be answered with discipline, or else the academy would drown in panic. Professor Valen argued fiercely that it was wrong to put Mason in such a position. Yet Mason himself agreed. He said, "Predators already walk these halls whether we like it or not. Better to show calm than let fear breed alone." So the next day, under the great dome auditorium, every student, every instructor, and even council observers gathered. The atmosphere trembled with unease. Security bots hovered near the walls, and at the center of the stage, a reinforced crate sat waiting. Inside was the same Razorback. Stalker sedated only lightly enough to wake with strength. When the crate opened and the stalker stepped out, spines rattling, jaws snapping. The crowd rippled with fear. Some cried out, others shrank back in their seats. Solari clutched the edge of her harness, but she kept her eyes on Mason, who walked forward, slow, steady. Each step measured his shoulders, relaxed, his breathing deliberate, his hands open. He did not carry a weapon, he carried only calm. The predator swung its head, jaws clashing against air, but Mason angled his body sideways, never meeting its eyes, never turning his back. He began to speak in that quiet rhythm that carried like heartbeat. "Easy storm, easy river. You will not chase what does not run." The students gasped when the stalker slowed its approach, puzzled by the lack of prey signal. Mason crouched to its level, moving no faster than grass swaying. He whispered about fear, about rhythm, about how courage was not absence but balance. He loosened one strap around, its neck enough for the creature to breathe freely. The crowd murmured, some fearful, some amazed. The stalker's spines lowered a fraction. Then it snapped again and the auditorium flinched, but Mason did not. He tapped the floor with 2 fingers, creating a beat steady as a drum. The predator cocked its head, uncertain. Its hunger pulled against its confusion. Mason filled the space with calm until finally the beast laid its head low. Not tamed, not broken, but quiet. Professor Valen stepped forward, her voice trembling yet strong. She told the audience this is not trickery. This is discipline, this is survival taught by one whose world demands it. Mason placed his hand gently on the creature's flank and said, "Fear learns manners when calm refuses." To leave, he rose and guided the stalker back into its crate, not with force but with rhythm, and when the doors sealed, the silence of the dome was absolute, until Solari's small voice broke it. She said, "Courage can be taught." Then the hall erupted, not with panic but with applause mixed with relief, mixed with awe. The council could no longer deny the truth. The inquiry ended, clearing Mason of suspicion. The saboteurs were exposed through the data trails. Valen had uncovered their actions, condemned, but more important than judgment was the shift among the students. They no longer looked at Mason only with fear. Many now sought his words, asking him to teach them to stand steady, to breathe calm, to carry courage like shield. Solari herself stood before the assembly delivering a speech, her voice quivering yet proud. She said, "We cannot choose where we are born or what worlds shape us, but we can choose how we answer fear today. I learned that courage is not silence of fear but the guidance of it, and I will practice until my fear learns manners too." The Academy rewrote its policies that season, integrating Deathworld knowledge into its survival curriculum. What once had been dismissed as dangerous instincts became valuable lessons. Mason did not boast. He returned to quiet walks and soft words. Yet wherever he went, students fell in step beside him, listening, repeating, learning for the first time in its long history. The Orion Exchange Academy admitted that humanity had more to offer than curiosity. It had wisdom born of surviving storms that never ended, as the dwarf star rose again, casting pale light across the domes. Mason stood at the edge of the gardens, watching students walk with steadier strides. He whispered to himself, "Not victory, not triumph, just simple truth. The lesson never ends. Fear will always return, but so will courage." And in that balance, the Academy found its new rhythm. Humanity's quiet mastery. The Academy had never felt so alive yet, so still, tension and triumph intertwined, as if the air itself held its breath. Students whispered to one another, eyes wide with awe, while instructors exchanged glances, acknowledging that something extraordinary had taken place. Mason Clark walked the halls as always, calm, measured, steady, yet every step echoed authority, born not of weapons but of experience. The predators, now confined to secure enclosures, eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, for they remembered the hand that did not strike and the presence that never flinched. Solari and her classmates practiced drills under his watchful eye, learning to approach danger with understanding, learning to measure heartbeat and breath and instinct, learning that the galaxy did not bend to fear but to respect earned through courage. Each student discovered a rhythm in the chaos, a balance between alertness and control that none had thought possible when Mason demonstrated how to handle a live predator. They had seen it move from menace to quiet without a single strike, and they understood that strength was not only in power, but in patience, in reading the unseen currents of life and knowing when to act and when to wait. Council members attended the final demonstration, standing along the balconies, observing as Mason led the predators in controlled exercises, each movement choreographed by understanding and communication. The students mirrored him, moving closer when invited, stepping back when cautioned, and slowly the auditorium became a living classroom of discipline and comprehension. The predators adjusted to human rhythm. They had never encountered such calm, such deliberate presence, their aggression tempered not by fear, but by recognition that these humans were not prey but forces to be acknowledged. News of the demonstration spread throughout the Orion Exchange Academy, and beyond, other species marveled at humanity's composure, whispering in council chambers across the sector that humans born on harsh worlds carried instincts that could tame the untamable. And Mason became a quiet legend, a figure who never boasted, whose lessons spoke louder than speeches, whose calmness became contagious. The Academy revised its curriculum emphasizing observation over reaction, understanding over panic, and every student who completed the program left with a confidence that could withstand storms both literal and metaphorical. Solari stood beside Mason one evening, watching the twin suns dip behind the domes, and she realized that fear no longer held the academy in its grip, that students could face creatures meant to terrify and yet respond with clarity and composure, that humans could teach what many species considered impossible, that discipline born from survival and courage born from necessity could shape minds stronger than any weapon. The predators in their enclosures watched, silently sensing the change, sensing respect, and perhaps even trust for the humans who moved among them without hesitation or arrogance. Mason placed a hand lightly on Solari's shoulder and whispered that this was only the beginning, that every student here carried a spark of something larger, something beyond instinct, something that could redefine encounters across the galaxy. She nodded, understanding that humanity's value was not measured in fleets or firepower, but in adaptability and wisdom, in the quiet mastery of self and circumstance that had been honed on death worlds where every step mattered, every breath counted, and that the galaxy would one day recognize that humans walked among stars not only as explorers, but as survivors and teachers. The predators slept peacefully that night, their spines low, their breathing. Even the council representatives departed with respect and newfound understanding, and as the academy lights dimmed, Mason walked the gardens alone, feeling the pulse of the world beneath him, and knew that the lessons would echo far beyond these domes, that fear would always exist, but so would humanity's response, and that the rhythm of courage would continue to grow with every generation. The end.